Hello, today is Wednesday, January 22nd, 2020. This is the Cluster API office hours meeting. Cluster API is a sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle, and this meeting is being recorded. We do have meeting etiquette, which boils down to let's all be kind to each other. And if you've got something to say, please use the raise hand feature of Zoom. And finally, we do have this agenda document. If you do have discussion topics, demos, PSAs, etc., please add them to the document below. And finally, before I get started, let's make sure that we all add our names to the attending list, please. And with that, one thing that we've started doing recently is just saying welcome to new attendees. So if this is your first meeting, thanks for joining us. And if anyone is new and interested in just saying hi with a brief introduction, feel free to unmute and introduce yourself. And if not, we'll move on to the discussion topics. Okay, so first up, Daniel, you've got something about control plane replicas and non-control plane workloads. Oh, Daniel is not here at the moment. Okay, maybe we'll give him some time to join. So let's move on. I do see Sudeep is here. So Sudeep, I will turn it over to you for your topic.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Actually, I just wanted to get a clarification on the end-to-end flow or the sequence of actions which are involved when we use the various controller like the CAPI controller, CAP-PK controller, and infrastructure controller. So, what is the sequence of action that is involved? I was looking at this link for the controller collaboration and specifically the cluster provisioning process, that step. And I can see that here we have the explanation like what are the sequence of actions that happen. But I was willing to know if we have more detail on this cluster provisioning process or the involvement of each of these controller. And also, like, what is the difference that we will see in V1 Alpha 2 versus V1 Alpha 3?
Sure, that's a really good question. So I'm going to hop over to the documentation for our master branch for Cluster API, because this is the most up-to-date for what's in development right now and what we're working on for V1 Alpha 3. And I'll point you to a couple of places. I do think that it would be useful to try and consolidate what we have in section 3.3 here under controllers with 3.4 for provider implementers. And I know we had a topic last week with Ria about trying to evaluate our documentation organization. So I won't get into that right now, but I will point you, for example, if you take a look at the cluster controller, it does have a flow diagram here for what is the expectation that, or what are the expectations for the cluster controller and what does it interact with? What is it waiting on? Some of these diagrams may be out of date slightly based on changes that we've made to the master branch. But if you combine something like the cluster controller with a cluster infrastructure provider implementer specification, you'll see some behavior here as well for a provider implementer. So for example, one thing you'll see here is when a cluster infrastructure provider, such as the Azure cluster provider, the AWS cluster provider, the vSphere cluster provider, and so on, when it sees a new updated deleted resource, it first checks to see if it's deleted. If it's not deleted, then it looks to see if it's owned by a cluster. And if it's not owned by a cluster, you follow this arrow and it basically says, I'm done. I just need to keep waiting. And then if you go back and you look at the cluster controller, you'll see, well, unfortunately, this is a bad example because this doesn't have what I'm looking for. But we should update the documentation so that it shows how it interacts with the infrastructure resources. We do have some of it listed in here, but in terms of the flow, it's not fully put together. But I would say the information that's in the controllers here, slightly out of date in places. Provider implementers is up to date for what we're doing in V1 Alpha 3, or should be, because they were written more recently. So between the two of these, as well as some of the proposals like the one you mentioned, hopefully that's a good starting point. And we are going to be working on trying to update the documentation so things aren't out of date anymore.
Okay, thank you, Andy, for that. But just one further question. Do we have like flow diagram or something like this for the Cuberium or the CapPK controller anywhere?
Yes, so the Bootstrap controller does talk about what's going on. This came from the proposal. So this is all we have for the Cuberium Bootstrapper. We potentially could do more. And then if you were trying to write a Bootstrap provider, be it for Cuberium or something else, this does, forget the diagram, it doesn't render on this, I need to fix that. We do have a diagram for this once we get it rendering, and it does have the same documentation for the specs for writing a Bootstrap provider.
Okay, so all the details that we see presently, these are for V1 Alpha 3. Is that correct?
For the master branch, which is what I'm displaying here, so you can see the URL is master.cluster.api, so on and so forth. If you just go to the cluster API book that doesn't have master at the front of the URL, this is for V1 Alpha 2, and you'll see that there's the provider implementers are not here. There's nothing in here about the control plane provider because that doesn't exist in V1 Alpha 2. So there's different versions of the documentation depending on if you're looking at what's out there released now or what's currently in development on the master branch.
Okay, can you please add that master branch link to the doc next to my topic? Yeah, thank you.
Give me just a second. Here we go. Most recent development docs for master. There you go. Did you have any specific questions about how two components interact, or do you want to take some time and look at the documentation and maybe come back later?
Yeah, I will do that. But I mean, more specifically, I was trying to understand the interaction between the, the CAPI, the CapBK controller, and the infrastructure controller. How they work in a sequence. All together. I was trying to get a consolidated view of all of these together.
Okay, sure. I can give an overview. So the cluster resource is meant to give you infrastructure that supports running nodes as a cluster. It doesn't give you servers that make a cluster. So for the AWS provider, for example, that'll create a VPC, an internet gateway, NAT gateway, security group, firewall rules, and so on and so forth. You combine a cluster with an infrastructure specific cluster. So I'm going to just stick with the AWS example. So you have a cluster and an AWS cluster, and you put those two together and you get the prerequisite infrastructure that you need to run your nodes. Then to create a control plane node, what you end up doing is you create a machine, a Cuberium config, assuming you're using the Cuberium Bootstrapper, and an infrastructure specific machine. And to carry forward with the example, that would be AWS machine. When you create all three of those, the Cuberium Bootstrapper is going to wait and make sure that the appropriate owner references are in place, and that there's a couple other things that it might check for, and then it will generate Bootstrap data, and at least in master, store it in a secret. And the AWS machine controller is basically waiting for that Bootstrap data to be available in a secret. And once it's available, it will go ahead and create an EC2 instance and make sure that part of the definition of that EC2 instance is to run the bootstrap data on startup. And once that happens, in theory, if everything goes well, you will have a one node control plane that is accessible at the load balancer that the AWS provider set up. And similar things would happen with Azure or OpenStack or vSphere. There may be some slightly different approaches for load balancers and HA and whatnot, but generally speaking, that's how the pieces fit together.
Okay, thank you. That was helpful.
Okay, Chuck, I saw you said you could speak to Daniel's topic, but I see Daniel is here now. So
yes, I was just going to say.
Daniel, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. This is just something, you know, as we're working on the control plane management for V1 Alpha 3, something that occurred to me is, right, users might be running their own workloads on the control plane machines. So, you know, just wanted to consider that, whether we should make any kind of, you know, if we should support those workloads especially, or take them into consideration when we're, you know, scaling up, scaling down, deleting, etc. It sounds like, you know, as far as like from the comments so far, that, you know, no, we'll just continue to focus on just on the control plane workloads. And if there are, you know, if there happen to be workloads, that's fine, but we're not going to take them into special consideration. And so I think that sounds fine to me. I'm going to, you know, like to PR a docs change somewhere just to make that very clear to end users. And then I think we can close this out. But yeah, I was also, I mean, if you know, if there's any comments here in the meeting that haven't been made to the issue, I'd love to get feedback here.
Tim, over to you.
Just for clarity, we'd still go through the standard delete process for any machine, control plane not being special in that regard, right? So standard drain would apply. So if standard drain applies, then, you know, I think it would coordinate drain the node prior to deletion.
Yeah,
so I think that is actually up to the control plane doesn't, at least at this point, I don't think explicitly, you know, drain or cordon.
The machine controller does it.
Right. So yeah, it should be the same.
Jason, is that what you were going to say?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. We defer that to the machine controller.
Okay. I agree with what Jason wrote. I think it makes sense to just make sure that people are aware what how the control plane machines are managed and what the implications may be, if any, for explicitly running things on the control plane machines. Okay. Any other topics? Anything anybody wants to talk about before I move on to looking at the couple of issues that we have that are not in a milestone yet? All right, well, if anybody thinks of anything while I'm going through these, let me know. Let's see, let's take a look at the oldest one here, worker node management only. And let's see, so somebody wants to potentially have the control plane managed some other way and let Cluster API just do the worker nodes, which I believe was the plan, at least initially, for adoption for something like COPS. But in terms of, let me read through this, it's been a few days since I looked at it. I think we probably could, like somebody could POC this if they wanted to. I guess it would maybe require some changes around control plane initialized and the it's not cluster API endpoints anymore, but the control plane endpoint going into master. Michael?
I'd say as of today is more or less how OpenShift consumes cluster API. We just use it to spin up workers. We don't really do any of the other infrastructure pieces.
Would you be willing to add a comment with some details for how you do that, and or at least respond to what's suggested in here?
Sure, I can put in our use case in this issue.
Cool, thank you. So I am going to bump this over to next, and priority-wise, I think it's probably some documentation in terms of what the work would look like. Documentation and maybe some code changes pending if there's any roadblocks. So I would just say probably backlog at this point, given that we are focusing on features for the foreseeable future, where Cluster API is fully in charge of things, but we certainly won't stop this from being possible. Anybody disagree? Speak up if you do. All right. Next up is Warren, generic labels for metric services deployed. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, I haven't looked at this. Are you on, Warren?
Yes, I'm there. Sorry. Yeah, I just happened to notice this. I don't know if it is expected or the labels are correct, but it seems like the labels for these metric services has control plane, and it just says controller manager, and not really specific like cluster API or kubeadm bootstrap controller manager. So I just created an issue just to bring it to attention. I don't know if this is the correct behavior or not.
I'm thinking that we probably would want to get rid of the generic thing here, and maybe this is where we want to use some of the labels we were talking about earlier today for the provider labels that you and Vince and Fabrizio and I were talking about, and Jason. But yeah, I would agree that this looks incorrect. So we'll go for help. Maybe it's a good first issue. We'll go with long-term, and I'll put it in the milestone mainly because it would be nice to fix it, but I would not consider it a blocker for getting this next release out the door. Okay. Last up is the one that I mentioned a little bit briefly earlier about revisiting the documentation structure. So Ria, is this something that you have some time to work on over the next few weeks or months?
Yeah, I can definitely look into it and find some people to help out.
Awesome. So this is long-term important, and I'm going to put this in next because we're not going to try and get that done in the next few weeks. So that is it for issues that don't have a milestone. In terms of V1 Alpha 3, one thing that we did mention at last week's meeting, and I think it's worth repeating, is that we're going to try and cut, whether you call it an alpha, a beta, or a release candidate, we're going to try and tag a release, a pre-release of the V1 Alpha 3 for Cluster API around Valentine's Day, so February 14th to 17th. The 14th is a Friday, 17th is a Monday. And ultimately, we would still like to maintain our early March release of 0.3. So I think it would be useful to try and do some burn down meetings. If we go look at the issues for Cluster API that are in the milestone, for example, there's 54. A lot of these are old, long-standing issues like documenting machine sets, and then several of them are newer and based on work for the Kube control plane or cluster cuddle. So we could do it now if people want to stick around and do it. We could try and set up another time. I know it's not particularly exciting to necessarily go through 54 or more issues, but given that we're trying to get a pre-release out the door in less than a month, I think that it would be useful to take a look at what's out there, whether you do it with us or independently. And if there's any areas that you have time and can help out, that would be great. But there are 54 here, and this is just core cluster API. This doesn't include any of the infrastructure providers, and that's a fairly large number given that we're trying to get this out mid-February for a candidate at least, or a beta.
Just a single question I have. Is there anything which is related to node being immutable or non-immutable?
Could you clarify what you mean?
So if I have a node and I want to actually destroy the node and recreate the node, or without destroying, I just want to change something and relabel the node. Is that practically, is it supported in Cluster API? Because that's a requirement which has spawned up for me in the Metal Cube. And
if
so
you want to label a node, you would get a kube config that points at the workload cluster's API server and just label the node directly. That's not something that Cluster API is going to be in the business of maintaining over time. It'll set initial node labels, but that's it.
Yeah, so relabeling is not there. That's the bottom line, what I want to know. Yes?
Correct?
Okay. So do we see relabeling coming anytime soon? Or,
no, it's out of scope for Cluster API.
Out of scope, okay. So how do we handle now if Metal Cube supports it, if for the bare metal, and I don't have support from Cluster API? Do I bypass the Cluster API then?
You use the Cluster API, you're a consumer, so whatever wrappers or behavior that you expect is on the onus of your implementation of how you use Cluster API.
Okay, thank you. That helps.
Yeah, and just to repeat what I said a minute ago, you would connect to your workload cluster and label the node that way.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I got a +1 from Vince to start doing a burn down now. So I hope you'll stay and see what's here, but if you don't want to, I understand. I'm gonna start at the bottom, oldest ones first. So we have document, machine set, and machine deployment. I do think this would be nice. If you look at our documentation, it doesn't really go into too much detail about how they work. So basically what I'm looking for in this burn down session is we're gonna try and decide collectively if this is in scope or out of scope for the milestone. And if it is in scope, ideally, it would be nice to find somebody who can work on it. Michael, did you have a question?
Yeah. Are we sorting these by any kind of priority? Because it looks like these all have the same priority, which is probably not a great system.
Machine set and machine, what called the deployment. I think we are looking at it, and I'm Prakash here. I would like to review it. Certainly it should be in the scope, because if we get it out, then it helps us in the bare metal operator which we are using.
Sorry, Prakash. Michael, to answer your question, these are not sorted. So Fabrizio suggested maybe filtering issues by area. I can do that. We could filter, I could do them by priority, but it would be unsorted. So like we could look at all of the critical ones, all of the important soons, all of the important long terms together, but within an individual priority, GitHub doesn't give us any ability to say that one issue is more important than another one.
Yeah, I just think, well, for the purposes of what we're doing right here, like starting with the most important ones seems probably like the better
All right,
way
so
to
we
go.
don't have any critical urgent ones, which is kind of nice. If we look at important soon, there's 33, which is still a lot. So I can go through these in numerical order. I can try to group them by functional area if that helps.
I thought starting at the most critical and then working down. I don't have any preference beyond that.
All right, well, there's 33 here, so I'm just gonna go through what I normally do and go oldest to newest. So I was just talking about documenting machine sets and machine deployments. This one, I think, David, is this still assigned to you? Yeah. Is this something that you have time for?
Let me see the title again. I'm sorry.
Document machine set and machine deployment.
No, I probably will not have time before Valentine's Day.
So can you add my name to it? I would like to look at it. P. Ramchan, PRAMCHAN @yahoo.com.
Do you have what's your GitHub?
GitHub is P. Ramchan. That's what I said. PRAMCHAN. P. Ramchan.
Okay. You are not in the, or it doesn't appear that you're in the Kubernetes SIGs GitHub organization.
I'm in the Kubernetes SIG. P. Ramchan @yahoo.com is my PRAMCHAN.
Would you mind commenting on this issue?
Yeah, I will. I will take it up and I will make sure that this is number 78, right? Yeah. Okay.
788. Yeah.
Yeah. 788. Yeah. 788. I'll comment on. Yeah. Sure. Thank you.
So I think my general comment, as much as I don't want to say this, is if we have a long-standing documentation issue like this one that didn't block previous releases, we could say it's not going to block 0.3 going out the door. I don't really want to say that, but this has been around for almost a year, and
yeah,
I would put it in the backlog if possible.
See, the reason is I have airship requirement from AT&T, and I'm reviewing this. We had in meeting discussed that machine set and machine deployment. If we can route it through to the Metal Cube or indirectly we can use it, we would like to have it. So that's why I would put it on a priority if we can.
Sure, if you have time to do it.
If I'm able to do it, I will put people and get it done. That's the way I look at it. Because it's needed.
I see you also said we could take the alternate approach and block the release on documentation. We could. I think timing-wise, it might not work out for certain things.
Yeah, it would probably be a lot, but just a suggestion if you don't want to just keep kicking this issue down the road forever.
Yeah, I don't. So we'll see what precaution his team can do.
Alan is there. Alan, you have any suggestions?
I'm going to move on because we have a lot to go through. So if you can comment on this asynchronously, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, sure, we'll do that.
This one, which is stale, is largely turned into waiting on the image builder documentation getting updated, and I haven't checked in on that. Tim, are you still?
He dropped, but I think I can close this because it doesn't apply to Cluster API like at this point.
Okay.
Yep.
So
I'll do it.
I think we should at least link out to the image builder docs.
We do.
Okay.
Yeah. Need to link to image builder docs.
Are we linking out to the new Netlify URL that they have?
No.
All right. Well, I don't think I'm going to clear Tim. Vince, you want this or anybody else?
Sure.
All right. Okay, next up is upgrading to CRD v1 for management clusters. I still don't think this is a strict requirement. it would be nice to have. I'm concerned about controller runtime and whether or not they can get a release out in time for us to consume it where we need controller updates to support CRDV1. Vince, I know you had opinions.
Yeah, I think we should try to do this as like much as possible. So like, let's not drop it out of the milestone, but I'll update as we go, and we can drop it if like we can't make it.
That's fair. All right. Define cluster cuddle move process. Fabrizio, I know you have a PR open for this. So do we just want to have your pull request close this?
Yeah. So keep it in the milestone. Hopefully we'll close it before the week. So.
Okay, can you make sure that your PR has the fixes 1525 in it?
Yes.
Thanks. Okay, document how to upgrade. We know we need to do that, and I definitely think this has to be written before we release. Add documentation guide for how to implement a Bootstrap provider. We did have, I know Liz had added, where did it go? The implementer's guide for creating an example. Which one did she do? Was it a cluster controller or something? And so there was this issue is about doing a guide for how to implement a Bootstrap provider. I'm going to suggest we move this to long-term and bump it over to next.
Do we want to let the assignee, do we want to leave it in the milestone and then bump it later if the assignee doesn't follow through?
I think it would be easier to keep, for tracking purposes, not to have to look at this every time we do a burn down. Like they can certainly continue to work on the documentation, and if they get it done in time, it can come into the milestone. But I am leaning towards just bumping it to next so that we don't look at it anymore unless there's a PR.
If I can suggest something, like maybe instead of bumping like things to the next, like things that like we might want to do, like let's just put backlog, and we can say like if they don't get done, like it's not a release blocker.
All right. Well, is there a distinction in your mind between long-term and backlog for something like this?
I guess like long-term, like it should still be done. Backlog is like really nice to have.
Okay, I can see that. So do you want to backlog this?
Sure.
Okay. Unable to delete cluster when infrastructure ref is defined incorrectly. And there was a lot of back and forth. I think, Warren, you were looking at this at one point, right?
Yeah. I think I was trying to help Prankul get some stuff sorted out. So I was just helping him debug, but I think he was the one who requested to work on the issue. So I didn't actually investigate further into it.
So can you also backlog the issue which we were talking about for cluster? Sorry, machine set and machine deployment?
I already did.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, this one is basically, you can kind of get stuck if you, actually I summarize this. You can have a cluster infrastructure reference that points to a kind that doesn't exist, that points to a resource that doesn't exist, that there's some sort of error in a couple different situations. I think we might need to tackle them individually, but I will check in again. And yeah, we'll just wait for a response. And if we need to, we can just make this either, well, we can make it long-term and kick it if we need to. Okay, events, service events and errors. And this was waiting for more details.
I think this can probably be closed if like a next cycle we do the conditions. Yeah. I can close it. It's fine.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Kubernetes Bootstrapper, define the usage of custom certificate authorities. We had a check-in 5 days ago and said they were going to work on it.
So this is the thing they're working on is just an addition of an example to the documentation. You could consider this, yeah, you could consider this closed for some definition if you wanted to.
I don't know, what was the custom certificates doc added like after this or before or after this issue was filed? I'm not sure what the time was.
I don't remember the timing of it.
Okay. Let me see what's in here. Yeah, it has a tiny example.
Right.
I would say for now we can probably close it. Is that what you would recommend, Chuck?
That's what I would recommend. Yeah, I mean, we can leave it open if that person wants to work on it, but we can move it to backlog or something like that.
Yeah, let's backlog. Okay. Right, add spec doc for control plane provider. This one was trying to get the what was initially added for the control plane provider moved into the provider implementers section, and I would like to see this done. It's on my plate, so I'll keep this in. Tracking issue for Cluster Cuddle v2 definitely stays in. Chuck, the E2E testing framework and implementation tracking issue. How are things over
here? Yeah, no, I think things there are good. I don't know if there's more we need to do for this milestone right now. Like there's more that I would like to do, but I think as far as this milestone is concerned, what I wanted to achieve has been achieved. So I'm happy to close this in favor of new issues going forward.
That sounds great to me.
Yep.
Thanks. Will you do that?
Yeah, I can take care of this.
Okay, thank you. Document approaches for infrastructure providers to consider for securing sensitive Bootstrap data. I do think this is still useful. We have a work in progress pull request for Kappa to encrypt the Bootstrap data so that it's less easily accessible. I think getting some documentation in here would be useful, but I'm going to put this on the backlog unless anybody feels strongly that it needs to stay higher priority. Okay. Document stance on static IP addresses. I'm going to put this on the backlog too. Control plane tracking issue will stay. This one that came around or came from a while ago on if you have custom images for Kubernetes, etcd, CoreDNS, that there's a lot of work that you have to do by hand to generate a kubeadm config that will use those. And this was initially saying it would be really nice if our images could just kind of figure that out and set a bunch of things. Where did we end up on this? We were talking about doing some defaulting. I think this probably goes to long term unless somebody's got cycles on this or for this. All right. More frequent releases. I think we're gonna start seeing this around Valentine's Day.
Yeah, I think it's fine to close this one.
Yeah. Okay. Document logging standards. Going to put this on the backlog. add liveness and readiness probes. We do have someone who did this for, where did it go? Someone did this for Kappa for us, and I guess it was Brunkle 88. Or no, it was someone else. So we should port over what we were doing in Kappa here, or is actually, I think it's still open.
Are you talking about the open pull request by Carlos?
Yeah, thanks. So I think we probably should, let me go get that. Where is that? Here we go. And maybe this is a decent question for the group. Don't need to answer it right now, but we're trying to figure out what port to use for the liveness and readiness probes. And at least for core cluster API, I believe we're using 8080 for metrics. And so we have this one that does 9440, just picking one. And then we have another pull request that is a follow-up. Neither of these is merged, to change Kappa's metrics from 8080 to 9090, but we already have cluster API on 8080, although I think we need to revisit every single metric we have. I don't know that they provide too much value at this point. So food for thought. If you have a preference for metrics port, let us know. Let me get this linked. Working for Kappa here. We should be consistent. All right, let me get rid of my other things here. Project roadmap, I still want to do, but I don't really think this needs to be considered as part of the milestone. Add cluster API E2E tests to CI. Is this done, Warren?
That's already done, I think. Yeah, I think that's already done.
Yeah, I think Chuck did that in a separate PR.
Chuck, do you want to verify and close?
Yeah, can you just assign that to me?
Yeah. Why is this me? Okay, thanks, Chuck. Introduce the control plane provider for cluster cuddle. You're working on this, Fabrizio, right?
Yes, there is a PR in flight. And
Okay.
it is I double check that it is linked to the issue.
Okay, thank you. Control plane health checks I know are in progress. We have a bug in our draining annotation here. And Vince, you were saying doing conversion. I think we need to check in. Let's see, define release cycle. Still want to do this, but I'm not going to have it be a blocker for this milestone. Document personas I still need to do, which is really just converting a document from Google Docs to Markdown. We fixed all of these, right, Vince? The errors, or do we still have some errors in our webhooks?
These are fixed, yeah. This particular issue is.
Okay, thanks. Where was I? Define constraints for upgrades crossing cluster API version. Fabrizio, did we get, like, you're working on this, right?
Yes, I'm sending the PR later today or tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. This is the one you're doing, Warren, right? Yeah. Okay. And we have our PRs for that. We have the machine health checking tracking issue. Michael, are you still here? There you are. Michael, or anybody from your team, I know there's a couple PRs out which I have yet to have time to review, but if anybody else has time, that would be awesome. Y'all are still looking like you're on track for sometime in the next few weeks for this, I imagine.
Yeah, I think we have somebody working on a PR at the moment for this.
Yeah, I think Joel was working on a couple.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. Control plane should scale up serially. Is anybody working on this yet? Doesn't look like
I don't think anyone's working on this yet.
Okay.
This is so I'm working on scale down, and scale up is kind of it needs the etcd health checks. So I'll ping Nadir. I can work on this and just stub out the same way that I'm doing for scale down. So
do you want me to assign this to you?
Yeah, I can do it. Or
okay.
I was actually just looking at the issue myself.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks.
Okay. Fixed glossary terminology. I know we had a open PR for this. That are we still waiting for an update on that, Chuck, or whoever was looking at this? Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, still waiting for the update.
Okay. Alrighty. Quick start, lack of instructions to determine control plane is up. Yeah, it is definitely lacking. Anybody want to sign up to work on this? That you, Warren?
Yeah, I'll do it.
So just a quick question on that one. Is that something that would be for the 0.3.0 release, since we have a control plane resource?
That's a good point. Michael, what you filed?
Yeah, I mean, it says, you know, when the control plane's up, do this, but it doesn't tell you how to check that the control plane's up.
Yeah, so in Alpha 2, totally fair point. In Alpha 3, like our answers for Alpha 2 versus Alpha 3 may be different if you're using the CubeADM control plane, although generically you can use, I don't know, Cube control version or something along those lines to check and see how the server is doing, how the control plane's doing. So
yeah, any of those things would be good instructions for the document.
So why don't we do one for release 02 that's a Cube control command or commands to verify that it's up and running, and then for master, we probably should still have that, but additionally we can add that if you're using the or because the quick start will presumably add in the CubeADM control plane, we can say, you know, additionally you can check the status on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be an object in Alpha 3, right, that you can look at and see some kind of status, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know what that is for the control plane. I really only know about the machine pieces.
Yeah. Are you good with that, Warren?
That makes sense. 2 PRs, one backporting to release 02, and then for master, just look at the control plane stuff.
Thank you. Okay, so that is all of the important soons, and we have now got it down to 20 by closing some and moving some to a different priority. So that's better. Let's now look at the long terms. We have about 9 minutes left. Let's see what we got here. 15. So, all right, let's make a decision on what to do with this thing. This has been around for a long time. I know I talked with Vince about it a while ago, and basically there was some code that was changed during a major refactor in, I don't know, early 2019, late 2018, that, or I guess, yeah, October 2019, that, or no, that wasn't, 2018, October 2018, that doesn't appear to have any adverse effects, but somebody really just needs to go through and track down, are we okay? And can we close this, or do we need to fix this? And I know I had assigned it to myself. I do not have time to look at this. So if anybody's interested, that would be really helpful. Or I think we can just close this, but it's lingering and I'm tired of just kicking it down the road.
I can look at it.
So let's see, what is the PR number on what is the issue number? 121. Okay, let me take a look at it. 970. Okay, I'll take a look at this. Thank you.
Okay.
970.
Is this the one where where the discussion went to trying to implement some tests around machine set to ensure that we don't?
Yes.
Right.
And so when I took a look at it, there are a few places where get new machine set is called, and it's called in different scenarios or situations. And so I think I tracked down, let's say it was 3 places that it's invoked. I think 2 of the 3 just don't care about this first return value. And I think there was 1 that maybe did, but I didn't have enough time to see if we could ever get into a situation where this would return nil and it would be a bad thing. Like it could be that you get down in here and it never returns, or it never goes through this code path, but I don't know. I didn't have time to fully investigate it. Okay, docs on architecture. Vince, what do you want to do with this one?
I mean, I think like we partially kind of like did this, so I'll close it at this point, unless someone else wants to do more.
Yeah, I mean, you know my personal feelings on like generic umbrella issues where I find them confusing and vague. So I would be happy to close this, and if people have suggestions for specific changes, then we can do individual tickets if they don't already exist.
Yeah, sounds good.
Meeting discussion. Okay. Update the CapD quick start once it ships in this repo, and we had some questions about should we just remove CapD from the documentation. I would kind of like to remove it, but I think there's some potential disagreement. Anybody like Chuck and Daniel, do you want to talk about it?
I'm not particular. Oh, sorry.
I personally use CapD for testing, so I like to find documentation about CapD, but it's not just a personal opinion.
I think we should keep it, maybe move it somewhere else though, like so that it's contained. It's like, hey, this is your local development. It's like kind of supported and kind of like a best effort. But I'm not volunteering to do it.
Yeah, I mean, we could even put it like in the tilt section or something. Jason, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so I agree. I like the idea of moving it to developer docs.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know that we want to support it outside of developer use cases. And the quick start to me isn't a place where developers are starting. It's a place where end users are starting.
Okay.
So I left a comment, particularly about end users, because I think someone that is not interested in developing Cluster API, but just wants to understand, wants to demo it, right? Kick the tires, so to speak, without having to deploy, resources that cost money. Having the Docker provider is a great way. It's just a fast way, and there are fewer opportunities for user error, right? Whether it's setting up the correct policies in AWS or having the right credentials. And so I feel like for end users, it's just an easy way to understand how all the pieces work together. So I think it would be valuable for the project to make the CAPD docs easily discoverable by an end user. But if we want to put them somewhere else, or make it very clear that this is not meant for running actual clusters, but just as for development or for a very kind of basic experimentation POC, I think that's fine. But I do think as an end user, it's a valuable tool.
Okay, Warren.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of echo Daniel's point. As a new user coming onto the Cluster API project, having if I didn't have any AWS accounts or anything like that, the CAPD documentation was very helpful to get started and kind of understand what components are coming up and down. I also kind of plus one it to moving to a developer docs, but having sort of the same kind of quick start format. So if there's a way from the main quick start to say, hey, if you want to try this locally, check out the developer docs. And then from there, the end user can actually start playing with it, and that kind of will, I think, propagate and the ease of, Cluster API consumption.
All right, I think we're going to end on this issue. Jason, let you comment, and then we'll probably wrap things up.
I was just going to say my one concern with leaving it somewhere for end user focus is I'm not sure we've dedicated enough time and effort to maintain it as such that it's meant for consumption by end users.
But aren't we trying to use this in our end-to-end tests and maintain it so that those pass?
Yes, however, having it as a dev tool, there's a certain indication that if a developer hits an issue, they can probably fix it themselves. An end user, you can't necessarily make that same assumption.
Chuck?
Yeah, I just want to iterate that we are supporting this and it is being used in our end-to-end testing. So if it's not working, with latest master, then it is considered broken, and I do spend time fixing it.
Maybe this is a long way of saying we should just leave it alone and make sure that it's updated in the quick start. I don't know.
Yeah, I have no strong feelings of where the documentation lives.
Daniel?
If we get inundated by end users saying, hey, this is, I'm trying to do this and it's not working for me. I haven't seen those in a channel, but if that's impacting us, or if we think it's a really bad experience for end users, and nobody who wants to keep this available or discoverable by end users is like me, right? If I'm not volunteering to sort of improve that, then yeah, let's get out of there. But it seems for now, I haven't seen any problems. But like I said, if there are, I'm happy to try to improve that. And if I can't, then I'm fine. Or if nobody else is interested in trying to sort of address those, then yeah, let's move it out. Is that something?
Yeah,
that we can
I think that's fair. I updated my comment just to say it's nice to keep the examples. We can debate the location of the docs over time. We are a minute over, but Jason, you have a question about CAPD on a Mac, and Warren says there's some documentation in there, and I think we should probably wrap. And we can resume looking at another burn down next week, and we can do it sooner ad hoc if people are interested as well. Thanks everybody for joining, and see you next week.